Most things in music theory are actually very easy to understand. People oftentimes think that music, or music theory, is very complicated, and are kind of scared of music theory. And it's not completely their fault. Because the reason that music theory, I believe, often looks intimidating is because the models and the tools that we use in our culture to explain music are very confusing. The worst one of these tools, in my opinion, is the staff. The staff makes certain ideas in music theory look way more confusing than they are to understand. Now, this video isn't about an alternative to the staff, and it's not about replacing the staff. I'm going to make a future video about some alternatives to the staff. But this video right here is just explaining some of the major issues with the staff. So, in order to explain some of the issues with the staff, I have to first explain some very basic music theory. So, let's say I play a note. This note doesn't really have any kind of emotion or context or anything like that. It's just a pitch or just a sound. And it's not until I combine it with the notes around it that this note sort of starts to get some kind of emotion. Like, let's say I play the note that's directly above it. So at first I play the note, and then I play this one. That starts to give this first note a little bit more of an emotion that goes along with it. Compared to if I play the note that we would call a perfect fourth above it. I'm not really going to get into those terms right now, and probably not even that much in this video, but let's say I play it with a different note that's a little farther from it. It sounds a lot different then. And both of these notes around it sort of color or sort of decide the emotion of it. And as you add more notes and you make the structures bigger, that's when you really start to change the sound just by changing the distance between notes. Like, let's say I play this chord. It sounds kind of bright, but let's say I take this middle note and I just lower it a little bit. Now the chord sounds like this and has a completely different feel. And if I lower it one more time, once again it changes it. And if I even lower it one more time, it changes it again. And all I'm really doing is slightly changing the distances between the notes, and it's completely changing the way it sounds. In music, we refer to these distances between notes as intervals. And intervals are sort of the building blocks used to create musical structures. And musical structures could be, for example, a melody, or they could be a harmony, or they could be a bass line. Whatever they are, they're created from intervals. So just remember this. Intervals are the distance between notes, and the distance between notes affects how the notes sound and how the notes make you feel and what the emotion from the music is. In music, it doesn't really matter which exact pitch a harmony, melody, or bass line starts on. A harmony, melody, or bass line can start on any of 12 pitches. It could start on, for example, this. Or it could start on this. Or it could start on this. Whichever particular note it starts on doesn't really change the emotion of what you're playing. What matters to affect the emotion is just how far is each note you're playing apart from every other note that you're playing, the intervals. I could talk about why the staff is a bad model, looking at how it represents any of these structures, whether they be harmonies, melodies, or bass line. But today I'm just going to talk about harmonies. So here's 3 really common types of harmony. We have the major harmony, we have the minor harmony, we have the diminished harmony, and we have the augmented harmony. These are three of the most common types of chords used for harmony. These harmonies are made from two different types of intervals and combinations of these two different types of intervals. That's why they all sound different. One of those types of intervals is this one. And this one is 4 spaces apart, or 4 potential notes that could be played apart. We call those semitones. So the first note would be here, and then this note is not played, this note is not played, this note is not played, and then this note is finally played to create the sound. The other one, the other type of interval that this is constructed from, or these harmonies are constructed from, is comprised of 3 semitones, meaning the notes are at least 3 spaces apart. So this note is played, this one's not played, this one's not played, and then this one is finally played. The combinations of these two types of intervals are what makes these different sounding chords. This is the chords I played earlier, visually represented on graph paper. As you can see, the augmented chord, each one of the notes sounding in it is 4 semitones apart. So it's created from a 4 semitone interval over here and a 4 semitone interval over here. And for the major, there's a 4 semi-interval between the bottom notes and a 3 semitone interval between the top notes. And the minor is just the reverse of the major. A 3 semitone interval between the bottom notes and a 4 semitone interval between the top notes. And of course the diminished then is the final option, which is a 3 semitone interval between the bottom notes and a 3 semitone interval between the top notes. Each one of these different combinations of 4 semitone and 3 semitone intervals is what characterizes and makes these chords sound distinctly different. The staff represents space between notes a little bit differently than the graph paper does. Intervals on the staff are sort of anticipated. What I mean by that is the people who created the staff kind of guessed what notes were going to be included in a song and what kind of emotions you were going to try to get with those notes. So if we were to play one note and then play the next highest note, it'd be kind of similar to the graph paper, except for that notes would be placed on either a line or a space. So for example, if our first note was right here on this line, the next note would then be on this space. And the next note, if we played one note higher, would be on this line. And for harmonies, or at least the kinds of harmonies that I was just talking about, the major, minor, and diminished, the way it would work is that the intervals are a little bit larger and the notes are a little spread farther apart. So rather instead, if a note is on a line, the next note would then be on the next line. And then the note after that would once again be on the next line. And same goes for spaces. A note would be on a space, and then the next note of the chord would be on the next space, and then the next note of the chord would be on the next space. So this image right here is an example of how the staff might represent a major, a minor, or a diminished chord. On the staff, it's very important to keep this consistent pattern of one note for each space or one note for each line. Now, the thing about the staff is it can actually represent this major, minor, diminished, and I didn't picture the augmented here, but I will in the next image, augmented chord starting on any line or starting on any space, because of each line or each space represents a different pitch. Let me show how the staff might do that. On the staff, each of these harmonies is always going to be either 3 notes on lines in a row or 3 notes on spaces in a row. That being said, whether they're major, minor, diminished, or augmented, is always going to look different. And the reason is because in order for us to represent these different spaces and intervals with the same shapes, we have to use little markers called accidentals to sort of tell us whether the note should actually be sounding 1 semitone higher, 2 semitones higher, 1 semitone lower, or 2 semitones lower than visually it might look at first glance like the note should sound. For example, if a note looks like it should sound one way, but it actually should sound 1 semitone higher, we would put a sharp by it. And if we wanted to sound 2 semitones higher, we'd put what we call a double sharp by it. And simultaneously, if we want a note to sound 1 semitone lower, we'll put a flat by it. And if we want it to sound 2 semitones lower, we'll put what we call a double flat by it. So why on the staff paper do we have to use these accidentals to represent what intervals we want? Well, the reason is because on the graph paper, each new unit of distance is the same as 1 semitone. Whereas on the staff paper, each new unit of distance sometimes represents one semitone and sometimes represents two semitones. On the staff, most units of distance are two semitones apart. Where this one semitone apart units occur is dependent on a couple factors. One of these factors is the clef. So for example, on treble clef, which is this sign, the lines and spaces that are considered one semitone apart would be these notes, these notes, these notes, and these notes. On the bass clef, these are the notes that are only one semitone apart. There's actually more clefs than just treble or bass clef, but fortunately most musicians only use these two. Do you remember this image from before of how we could potentially represent some harmonies on the staff? Well, if simply all we do is change the treble clef to a bass clef, we now get different chords with the same images. So while these might look like they're all the same sort of chord, simply changing the treble clef to bass clef changes where the half steps occurs and ends up fundamentally changing the structure of each one of these harmonies. So now rather than getting a major, a minor, and a diminished harmony from placing notes on these groups of lines and spaces, we get a minor, major, and another minor harmony. Clef isn't the only factor that can determine half step and whole step location. Key signatures can actually account for 12 different variations of where the half steps and whole steps occur as well. For example, if we apply this key signature, usually referred to as the key of E flat, it would functionally change these shapes to also having major, minor, and diminished sounds. Clefs and key signatures are the factors that determine where half step locations are. But of course you can still change structures just by adding accidentals. So for example, if I put a sharp here, implying that this line should sound one semitone higher than anticipated, then this diminished now turns into a minor. So in conclusion, to understand any harmony structure on a staff, you have to first consider which particular line or space it started on. Second, you have to consider which clef is applied to the staff, which one of two, potentially four clefs. 3, you have to consider which of 12 different key signatures is being applied to the staff. And 4th, you have to account for any accidentals that are being applied to the shape. This is a lot of different factors that can convolute and make very confusing understanding what you're looking at. Here's what the staff's actually a little bit good at. The staff is good if you're playing anything just based on the major scale. So as long as any melody you're playing, bass line, or harmony is just picked from the notes on that scale, you don't really have to do too much to represent them. As long as every interval that you're using can be found somewhere between two notes that could be included in the same major scale, you can represent every single note with just a line or a space. And if you want to change where the half steps occur to, for example, change which note might be the starting note, all you have to do is add a key signature. Being able to change the key signature might seem like it makes the staff better, but it really doesn't. Because even though the staff becomes functional by being able to change the key signature, any structure you learn to identify on the staff, you still have to learn how to identify it for 12 different key signatures, 2 different clefs, and any accidentals that could be applied. This is a really, really difficult and completely unnecessary learning curve. And the only reason it exists is because the staff was designed in such a way that every note needs to get a line and every note needs to be able to get a space if we were to play the major scale. For me, the single worst aspect of the staff is that it has a tendency to convince musicians that certain things in music are easier than other things. And the reason it convinces them that those are easy is because the things that it seems to show as easy are simply the things that the staff was designed to be a little bit better at visually representing. And unfortunately, it can affect absolutely how we educate new generations of musicians, convincing them to play certain sorts of things and changing their tendencies as composers. So I'm going to end this video with a metaphor. Let's say hundreds of years ago, all of our buildings were built from bricks. And the ancient architects who used to build our buildings decided that we should use design paper using a brick pattern, just like the buildings we build. And they also realized that oftentimes half bricks were very useful in certain key locations. And they began to include half bricks as part of the design on the papers that they created. And they also assumed that experienced builders could anticipate the location of some of these half bricks, and they wouldn't have to actually visually represent them, and could instead represent everything as a full brick, whether it actually was a half brick or not. And over time, as new building practices were discovered and new locations for half bricks were discovered, no one ever bothered to change this original design. And instead, little notes and little footnotes were added to kind of make adjustments and help guide builders. And then consider that as time went on, all education for new architects, teaching them about building structures, was completely based on this visual pattern that was developed hundreds and hundreds of years ago, when all we knew how to build from was this brick design. Consider how that might actually affect the evolution of construction in our culture. That's sort of how I believe the staff is, and sort of the role I believe it has in music education, is keeping certain old structures in place and making them very difficult to remove, even when naturally their time has come. Thank you.